This is part three of the chapter 12 on family. Parts three and four, we're going to be discussing the five primary changes in family structure that we are experiencing in contemporary society. In this part three, we are going to be talking about the first two, the rise of serial monogamy, and then the increase in single households and cohabiting couples. But in general, the five primary ways in which families have changed from the past to today, in addition to those two, are the increase in single parent households, the increase in employed mothers in dual earner households, and then, of course, the recognition of same sex marriages. What's important to know is that, these changes in family structure, people can have very strong opinions about them, with some people thinking that they are good for society, some people thinking that they are bad for society, some people saying that it makes no difference. And in sociology, we classify people's stance on these changes as being either acceptors, people who think that it is largely good for society, that these changes in family structure and family have come about. Rejectors, people who reject the idea of the changing family structure as being a social good or a positive. And then skeptics. They're open minded about the changes, but they are skeptical as to whether or not they are actually positive for society as a whole. So, beginning with serial monogamy, or what can be called the marriage, divorce, remarriage trend. So, we've talked about divorce way back at the start of this class, when I introduced the concept of the sociological imagination and theory. Like week one, week two. But just a reminder that divorce is the legal process of dissolving a marriage. And we saw the first kind of bump in divorce rates after World War II, but where we then saw a dramatic increase was between 1960 and 1980, and we call that time period the divorce revolution. And a lot of this was escalated by California passing the first no fault divorce law in 1970, and then other states quickly followed suit. Before that, people could only divorce for select reasons, and it involved them having to make an accusation or charge against the other party, which led to divorces being both emotionally messy, and aggressive affairs that frequently involved attorneys and detectives. With the creation of no fault divorce laws, you could get a divorce without claiming it was the other person's fault. You could just say that you had irreconcilable differences and you didn't need a specific reason. So when those laws were passed, what we saw was a kind of dramatic increase in the number of people getting a divorce, and it did level off in the 90s, but it leveled off at a relatively high rate. And so the two charts that you can kind of see, that first chart just kind of shows the divorce rates that exist, the percentage of Americans who are divorced by race, and you can see that African Americans and whites have slightly higher divorce rates than Latinos, and Asian Americans have significantly lower divorce rates than these other groups. So, why do people get a divorce? We know that some of the primary factors that contribute to divorce are economic woes, as well as infidelity, um, as well as just kind of the pressure that comes with raising children. We study that those are all contributing factors, and I'll go over a little bit more of those later in the presentation. One concern that we consistently have about divorce is the impact it has on children. Um, and even the certainly it is better to get a divorce than to remain in an abusive or toxic relationship, but it is worth noting that most research on child outcomes show that children do benefit from being in two parent households. And so children post divorce oftentimes do suffer both economic, academic, as well as emotional repercussions. Um, but it is worth noting that as our divorce rates increased, a new trend did emerge, and that is serial monogamy, the marriage, divorce, remarriage trend. And that marriage, divorce, remarriage trend, of course, created what we commonly call blended families, and the kind of more sociological, academic term is binuclear families. And so, today's newlyweds, about 60% are first marriages, but 20% are remarriages with both husband and wife, or 20% are remarriages with either the husband or wife having been married before. So this is a growing trend that we see in the United States. Of course, divorce itself has some kind of geographic tendencies. You have some places that have much higher divorce rates, other places that have much lower divorce rates. Obviously, if you live in an area with a high divorce rate, it does mean that you are going to have more partners in the dating pool that were previously married, which increases the remarriage rates in those areas as well. But coming back to kind of why do people divorce, as sociologists, we can talk about this on kind of three sets of levels. There are societal levels, demographic reasons, which just means we can kind of look at statistics. What are the statistical odds of people getting a divorce based on their demographic traits? And then there are micro level reasons that exist at the individual level or between individuals. So at the societal reasons, I've already talked about the big one, the change in divorce laws. The passage of the no fault divorce law definitely increased the people's willingness to get divorced and likelihood to get divorced. Changes in religious institutions. A lot of religious institutions used to have very strong stances on divorce and not permitting divorce. But as time has gone by, a lot of religious institutions have kind of lessened those constraints, and people have responded accordingly. Economic reasons. Divorce is actually more common, even though the strain in people's marriage increases when money is tight. Divorce is more common when the economy is doing well, and that's probably because people feel a lot more confident that they could leave a marriage and set up an independent individual household. They don't have to stay together to pool their resources. Military service, especially in times of war or occupation, sees a bump in divorce just because of the strain that it puts on people's families to be away from their military spouses, as well as, of course, when their spouses maybe return from service, the kind of mental health, anxiety, PTSD that can come along with that. In general, cultural values around marriage, sex before marriage, acceptance of towards divorce, all of that has changed in the last few decades, making divorce a less stigmatized identity. um, Social integration. People get their identity from a lot more parts of society beyond just their family. They have identities from work, from friend groups, from their religious institutions. And so, in that way, as people are more socially integrated, they do not necessarily have to rely solely on their family that they formed as a source of social identity. And of course, technology. Technology has both made it easier to engage in infidelity, and it has also made it easier for people to be caught when they engage in infidelity. Demographic reasons. Your book talks about this when it talks about, the dangers of using statistics to predict divorce likelihood. We just know by throwing different variables into the equation that there are certain demographic characteristics that make it more likely that your marriage will end in divorce. We sometimes have a good reason to explain these findings, and sometimes we don't. Um, Parental divorce is one, and there might be a lot of reasons for this, but certainly people who had parents who divorced are more likely to divorce themselves. Age at marriage, the marriages that begin at early ages, early age marriage is more likely to divorce than people who marry later in life. Premarital pregnancy and childbearing. So if you have children before getting married, before you marry your partner, this increases the likelihood of divorce. Premarital cohabitation, that's an interesting one, and I'll come back to that one when we get to the cohabitation section that's coming up. Presence of children, and the presence of children in the household. The greatest divorce risk occurs when children are very young and then when they enter the teenage years, and this could just be because of the difficulties associated with parenting both newborns and toddlers as well as teens. There are differences based on your gender, your race, and ethnicity. Employment status and income. Once again, there are differences based on social class. Religiosity. The more religious you are, and especially depending on your denomination and affiliation, the less likely you are to get a divorce. Education. Higher education. People that are highly educated are less likely to divorce than those who aren't. And then similarity between spouses. And this is what your book was talking about when it was talking about racial intermarriage, and the high rates of divorce that can occur when you marry outside of your race. But just in general, whether it's marrying outside of your race, marrying outside of your religion, marrying outside of your social class, the more alike you and your spouse are, the less likely you are to get a divorce. And then individual micro level reasons. People have unrealistic expectations of their spouses. Obviously, if you're experiencing conflict or abuse, infidelity is a big one at the micro level. And then just communication and marital satisfaction. If you're unhappy, if you have communication issues, if you argue all the time, then combined with some of the societal reasons that we just talked about, all of these things contribute to the no longer increasing, but relatively high and stable rate of divorce that we have in our society. And this is just a chart from your book that, just kind of shows that statistically we know that some things either increase or decrease the likelihood of divorce. But the statistics don't tell the full story, which is why we don't necessarily always know kind of what the underpinnings of these statistics are, like why is it happening? And as I mentioned, that concern is always, what is the impact on children when they get a divorce? It's worth noting that in most cases, post divorce, most women are granted primary custodial status. This is one of the few areas in society where women do have a real gendered advantage and edge. That if both parents wanted to be the primary custodial parent, because of the assumptions that we make about mothers and nurturing, women are often granted that status at a much higher rate than men are. But then, it's just worth noting what happens to fathers' contact with children after divorce. Compared to the past, more fathers do maintain frequent contact with their children after divorce. This was less the case in the 70s and the 80s, but you still see that are fathers that have minimal contact, and there are fathers who have decreasing contact where they start off having frequent contact, but then it decreases over the years. And this is significant because it is that presence of both parents, and that seems to be very critical for children having smooth transitions after their parents' marriage ends. The second kind of major structural change that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the rise of single households and the increase in cohabitation. So, first of all, as I've already noted, more households are single than at any time period. Part of this, of course, is the gender gap that exists in ages, so that as people get older, there are more likely to be women are more likely to live longer than men, in which case they outlive their partners, and that increases the likelihood that they are going to be in a single household. There are especially for racial minorities. There are growing numbers of never married, particularly for women. And that increases the number of single households. But one major contributing factor to why we have so many single households at any given period of time is because people are not necessarily not getting married, but they're waiting longer to marry. And so they plan to marry someday. It's just someday has become a lot longer than what it used to be. And so, why are people waiting to get married? Big part of it is economic uncertainty. People want to achieve a certain level of financial stability before getting married. This is compared to the past, where people often got married and built their finances together. Now you have people wanting to have some level of financial independence before saying I do. Certainly, women's increasing participation in the labor force means that, unlike previous generations of women who were maybe much more decidedly focused on getting their MRS degree, as people would say. You have women now that are very invested in their educations and careers, um, and gaining in those areas maybe before prioritizing marriage. So, not that they don't ever want to get married, but that the focus is on education and career first. Certainly, the fact that sexual relationships outside of marriage have become more acceptable and contraception has become a lot more effective means that you don't have people rushing into marriages in order to have sex, and you don't necessarily have as many people, having what we used to call shotgun marriages, where because of an unintended pregnancy, people marry, have these unplanned marriages in order to save face. And then, of course, just with that kind of rising divorce rates, high divorce rates, there is less eagerness to get married and thus risk divorce. So people put a lot of pressure on themselves to get it right. And in wanting to get it right, they are perhaps moving a lot more slowly to the altar than the generations before them. Now, at the same time, we have people remaining single for longer and postponing marriage. We have had an increase in cohabitation. From the last census, it was a little under 12% of couples were living together who were not married, and this is compared to 1% back in the 1960s. And so this rise in cohabitation has proven to be a little bit of a challenge to census takers, because, if you are cohabiting, you do not meet the census definition of being family. So, what the census has done is they, in the past, have qualified cohabitors as being possilques, persons of opposite sex sharing living quarters. And this is meant to try to distinguish between roommates. Now, this is obviously problematic because it excludes same sex couples. So, the kind of challenge in the 2020 census will be, how do we get this data on cohabitation if we don't consider cohabiting couples to be families? But we also need to be aware that not all cohabiting couples are heterosexual. And so this is another way of just kind of measuring the increase of couples who are cohabiting over time. And you can see that the projected number of couples in the millions is going to continue to go up in 2020. The big question, I think, and what I lightly touched on when I said that a demographic characteristic related to increased divorce risk was cohabiting. Common sense would say if you cohabit, that this should make your marriage stronger because you know your partner better and you've been living together, and so you probably shouldn't experience that shock that comes with living with a person. But Statistics actually show that cohabiting increases a couple's risk of never marrying, or if they marry, increases their risk of getting a divorce. And we call this the cohabitation effect. The fact that cohabitation does not lead to better marriages. And we don't have a great answer as to why. Two possible answers that are offered, one of which is called the role of inertia or sliders, meaning that some people who get married after cohabiting aren't necessarily enthusiastic about getting into a marriage, but they kind of slide into it because it's, we've been living together, this is convenient. Maybe you're dropping hints about how badly you want to get married, and it's easier to just marry you than to break up with you and move out. And so that lack of enthusiasm, that lack of real desire to marry, perhaps then later comes out in an increased likelihood of divorce. And the other kind of explanation that's frequently offered for the cohabitation effect is called the selection effect. And the selection effect is really just a kind of statistical term that means there's something else going on here. And in this case, the something else going on is religion. If people who are very religious are less likely to get a divorce, and people who are very religious are also less likely to cohabit, then it's not necessarily that fact that cohabitation increases people's likelihood to get a divorce so much as it is, if you are the type of person who is willing to consider cohabitation, then you probably are also the type of person that has no problem considering divorce when things go badly or when you want out of the marriage. So that is it for this part three. The final part, part four, is going to tackle the final three structural changes to families that we have seen in contemporary societies.